But let me get into the planting design stuff here. So if I close, yes, I think we can save. And then we're going to open up. I want to make sure I have the right one. Planting. Okay, so this will take a second, but the planting, this is a very intensive approach to planting. It's very rules driven and very much and can be very data driven. And so if you have a database of plants, which I know you guys are building, you can hypothetically pull those plants in via a component. So this, for example, I've created a limited area to show you kind of a transect of how our plants are working here. But I'm pulling in some data from our ERA plant database. This is an American database. This is the one that we've mostly based a lot of stuff on. And we're in the process of fingers crossed, creating an open source database that's more global, and hopefully everyone can begin to contribute to that. And we want people not just using Landkit, but other applications to use this database. And we want to make it open source, but we want to provide some ways for people to contribute. And we're going to be modifying Landkit to be more to play nicely with that database as well. So this is I'm sort of saying bring in 150 species from this database, and the database has plant names, and unfortunately it's like in feet and things like that. And there's some strange things if you guys are wanting to kind of use the database side of this, that you may have to do a few small strange things, and we could talk about that maybe in the questions. But it's sort of pulling in the plants, and it, just like with the walls, it creates all these plants, right? So it's it shows you the plant species name. So it's a little bit more descriptive than wall, at least. But then we have this little thing here, which this is our kind of litmus test that sort of says, hey, if the color is the default gray color, which means that there was no color in the database, don't use that. And we call it out. So instead of 150 plants, we end up with 60. So that kind of gives you a sense of there's some missing holes in this existing database that we have. And it's part of why we want to make an open source database that a lot of people can begin to contribute to. There's a few other things. I don't usually start this way, but I think it's an interesting conceptual way to start. So once we have our plants, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to add a niche according to a data field called flower color. So that's one of the data field. We were using flower color to determine whether or not to include our plants. And then this thing applies the niche from the data. So all the data that's brought in is not necessarily part of the attributes of the plant. I like to think of it as like the pollen sac on the legs of the bee. It's there, it's genetic material, but it's not technically part of the bee, right? And then this thing kind of does gene splicing, and it starts to say, like, take this attribute and make it part of the plant and part of the niche of the plant and the rules that we're going to use to place the plant. But then because it's a color, we're going to give it a buffer, a cushion to that plant. So we actually pull that niche out and we add a cushion to it and recreate the niche. So these are some like data manipulation tools we have, and there's a bunch of these for Plantkit. There's a ton of tools here for Plantkit. So all this data stuff, there's the query, there's changing attributes, changing niches, merging niches, creating rules. There's a number of things. But then we also are going to apply sun exposure and soil moisture without any changes. And then we can use this merge niche component to merge the plants with the niches that we've separated out down here. I'm not including those colors right now. I'm actually bypassing, and this is not focused on color, but we will plug that in later, and I'll show you partly because this works a little, the fewer rules you have, the faster it works because the fewer tests that are happening. Let's kind of zoom out here, and I want to show you a big high level view of this script. So this here is what we just looked at. This is the plant. This is how we sort of pull in plant data and manipulate plant data. Then we create an environment back here, which uses a terrain that we had from our topo kit. And with a very small site, you could actually have topo kit and plant kit running at the same time. I wouldn't recommend that for anything bigger than this site. We actually had we did have planting running at one point, but for the demo, I wanted to kind of separate that out. So we create an environment, and then this is interesting because this is all of the analysis layers that we add to the environment. So typically, when we create an environment, when we are designing, we do analysis, but we rely on our brains to translate those analysis layers into design decision making, right? And in this case, because of the nature of planting, or at least placing objects according to rules, we can take those layers and keep them within our data structure. And then here we're creating planting areas, and then here we're doing plant placement. And then here we're visualizing those plants. And the plant placement is interesting because the plant placement is very small. We do all the work up front, and the plant placement happens, this is the closest thing to a black box that we get within Landkit, but it's all based on the rules that we're establishing back here, right? So it's not a black box. There's so much control the designer has, and that's our hope. We're not trying to create an AI algorithm to sort of automatically solve all your planting design problems. That's not the point. We want the designers to make decisions about what are the important things, what are the effects, and whether or not those effects are kind of the right effects and the right outputs and the right performance, things like that. So let me just show you really quickly these analysis layers. So we have a few layers. So there's sun exposure, and this is a really cool tool that we've added, which is our draw. You can draw the analysis layer very easily. All you do is you just give it the environment that has all the layers, and then you change what the name is of the environment. So in this case, we have sun exposure, and so this is kind of sunny, part shade and shade. We can do soil moisture, which we defined as areas. So we did that using a shape layer. So you can see that here. The neat thing, let me just go back and show you what that looks like. So yeah, so here, it's just a few components and a few layers. We have a parent layer called soil moisture. We draw all our dry shapes on the dry layer and all of our moist shapes on the moist layer. And then this little component will bring in all of the necessary shapes and values from that parent layer and sort of give us the layer name. And then we plug that into here and create a shape analysis layer. The neat thing, and the thing you might have noticed to be curious about, is how is it figuring this out? It's looking at every cell within that environment and first calculating the largest shapes, right? So it says, okay, the largest shape here is dry, and so all of the cells go dry. And then when we whenever it gets to smaller shapes, it will change these ones to a value of moist, right? And then in this area in the middle, these shapes, this moist area is larger than these small dry areas, which are the mounds. And so within all these little valleys around the mounds, we're saying that's probably going to be a little bit more water from, as the watershed of each mound. So it's a little, we're doing some of this stuff manually, and we're hoping eventually, we're working toward having water aspect be able to be calculated, and you could actually do this stuff more automatically, and you wouldn't have to draw shapes like this. But the other thing that this illustrates is that you can draw shapes for anything, right? It could be environmental things that are within your database, but they could be for just wacky rules that you're making, like, oh, this is this plant typology, and this is going to have these different rules, or, you know, you can define things in a very flexible way. There's also sunshade. We're using a little bit of, this is within this is a ladybug component for sunshade. We've packaged it up just because all we need are the sun vectors. And we're hoping, again, to integrate this into our own tool set eventually. We're trying to kind of build the things that don't exist first, and then we'll begin to kind of pull in a few things that just make the toolkit more complete. But this Ladybug does this so well, and we give them so much credit for their environmental analysis. That's another consideration we're sort of making is do we just integrate more fully into their, you know, their ecosystem, and how their stuff translates directly into Landkit. But yeah, so then you can also measure proximity to anything. So the proximity in this case is an edge proximity to the edges of the shapes. But we created a layer. If I show you, we created this is the layer, and we actually have a solid area here because we wanted the proximity value to always be 0 in that case, because what we're trying to do is create a rule that says, given a range of 0 to 10 feet of proximity, map that to a height constraint from 1 to 5 feet. And that allows us to control the height of the plants according to how they come to that edge, but and also in this case, how they act in relation to the roof, right? Because we don't want tall plants up on the roof, because we'll mess up the, you know, alligator's face, and there'll be more weight and more soil and all those things, yada yada. So we have all of our environmental analysis. We have our plants. We can very quickly create a planting area. So we're doing a couple things here where we're using the edges of our areas to create our planting design whenever we're doing the full thing. So you can see, you know, that's when we're creating planting across the whole thing. And then here we're just using our test shape, which is this shape here, this little transect. And so we just use that, and we create a planting area, and it's just like the plants, or just like the topo, it's its own class of object, which means that we can add planting to it, and we can successively do things before we get the plants out of it, or before we sort of draw it. This is a tiny sneak peek of Paving Kit, where we're using Paving Kit to generate a quick pattern. So we're creating a little hex pattern, which then we get the centers of each of those. It's doing a plane, which what have I done? Sorry, it was pausing. I didn't lose you guys, did I? Okay. So then we get our points here, which then can be used as the pattern for where we'll place our plants. The cool thing about this is you can create your own pattern. So you could have like rows that kind of do this, and then rows that do that in these different areas. And you could say, okay, I know that structurally the planting is going to do this. I just need to fill in what those plants are, right? According to these rules that I'm setting up. And then so your fill pattern constrained. This is a very important component. This is, like I said, the sort of semi-black box here. We have our plants coming in. You can weight those plants. So if you have weight values according to each plant, you could have more plants, certain plants than others. You can also change that by changing the W attribute of the plants. So like if like you change that in terms of data, you could say, oh, all of the flowering plants are going to have double weight. So they have 2 and the default is 1. So you could just change those to 2, and then all of a sudden you've got like twice as many of those plants as you have of the others. There are some limitations here. Whenever you're constraining them, it's calling them out, and it's hard to keep track of the exact, quantities. We try as hard as we can to make it, kind of meet those weight values, but the weights allow you to kind of adjust. You might say, oh, well, actually we want 3 times as many in order for this to work right, so but at the same time, you can feel it out, and you can kind of shift things, and you're not replacing however many plants. You're just changing the rules. So we have the planting area that we're going to populate. We have the pattern of points. You have the number of tries. So 50 tries is actually kind of a lot, but it's only going to do as many tries as it needs to. But because we have 60 different plants, if we're not trying at least 50 times, I mean, we might want to turn this up to 60 possibly, but and whether they're fixed or not. So this is, you can technically do packing after the fact. So if you want to fix plants, this is a neat thing. You can have certain plants that are fixed and others that are not, and then run packing, and the packing ones, the ones that are not fixed will pack around the ones that are fixed, and the fixed ones won't move. So there's some really neat dynamics there as well. And there's a few other, whether it's constrained, that the default's going to be true. There's another component similar to this called fill area with plants constrained, and this is going to give you a much different, let me see, plug this in. Just use we're just going to use the defaults here. And so this will give you, let's just plug that into here. So this is going to give us a slightly different layout, right? It's not according to a structure, it's more organic. But if we were then to do the packing, I'll just show you what the packing looks like. Plug this into here, and then plug this into here. The thing that takes a long time to draw, I've discovered, you can see how they sort of shifted around one another. So if you're doing a more like organic part of your planting design, and then you want to fill in other parts with pattern that's more constructible, with contractors will kill you if you do all organic everywhere. Just a warning, don't die. Yeah, so the other way to do this is to sort of say change the packing ratio to 2, because you can see that we're not getting full coverage, and that's because it's not as many plants are. This one works a little differently. That with the pattern, there's a point, and it keeps trying that point, whereas here it tries to place everything, and anything that doesn't fit just doesn't go. And so there are 2 slightly different strategies here, but you can see that if I go and plan. Let me turn off this. So you can see how these plants are packed in nicely around one another, and it has a very alluring effect. But yes, be warned, trying to construct this is much different, as a rule. But once we have our robotic plant placement tools, our robotic plant constructors, we'll be all set. So that we're planning for the future. Yeah, so once you have that, and I'm going to plug this one back in, the patterned one, just for now. We're using blocks that we generated. So we have this layer over here where we use Grasshopper to generate all these crazy plant blocks. So pretty fun. We're hoping to maybe integrate this at some point where it's part of the tool set, right? And you can just have your own, generate your own plant blocks. Yeah, so those, and then it takes those blocks. So first of all, they're blocks. Second of all, it uses this script, and we're doing some custom stuff here, which is, you can see this is not just Landkit. This is a bunch of other little stuff that we're doing. But Landkit will do a schedule, right? And so you can use this symbol. If I use the symbol, it's just going to draw a circle, right? But we're doing a bunch of stuff in order to make it draw a block instead, and eventually that'll go away. It'll just draw. You'll be able to it'll be an option. But there we go. So we can see the plant. It tells us how many of each. It's a plant schedule. It also gives us what were the factors involved in some of the rules, and it doesn't necessarily show. In this case, it's not showing. Well, I guess we didn't have color. We don't have color plugged in. So once we plug color in, that will show up as well. You can also export this to a CSV in case you need a plant list for just other stuff. And there's some parameters for drawing this schedule. There's also, and we're not using the right plant database here, but there's also a tool that will draw the bloom calendar over time if you have the months properly formatted. And that's the problem with our data here. We need to add in ranges that we're not using the ranges yet for that. So yeah, what's the other thing? Drawing block. So we have blocks as a preview, and we can bake those. We're using Elefront to sort of generate kind of regenerate. Oh no, just to place the block. Sorry, just to place it. But we also have a tool of our own now, where if you just click this button, it will bake all of your plants. You just plug them into here, and it just bakes them onto a layer. You can change the default name. We have a name called plant blocks. And so let me just return as I wrap up here. Let me just return to. There's also a tool which will send everything to different DAE files for each species that you can then kind of use to. We love that for Lumion, where you can pull in a whole species with all the nodes and then replace all of them at once with, mass replace it, and then bring in the next one, mass replace, next one, mass replace. Of course, there's no scripting within Lumion, so we haven't written any actual script on that side to ingest it more quickly, but who knows? Down the future, we'll see. So let me just turn that off for a split second and kind of rebuild our site here. I'm going to turn off topo and show you, we have our whole site, and then we have, this is an example where I did plug in those color rules, and it takes like a minute to run. And I highly recommend, if you have a site that has thousands and thousands of plants, work in a small area, and it's a scalable solution. So you can work in a small area, and then you can plug in the big area when you're ready to go get a coffee, or when all the rules are working the way you want them to be. And then you can bake, and you have all of these things. You can see that the neat thing here is this is not just based on color. This is also based on the other rules as well. So it's solving for multiple things at the same time. It's solving for the colors we're asking for, and also these other things. But the other cool thing is that if you just want to kind of let the rules, dictate what you end up with in terms of mixes, you can do, in this case, it's mainly just based on the sun exposure and the soil analysis, the moisture of the soil. So the cool thing is we get all of this variation inside of the kind of ridged back of the alligator, and we get a very clear, distinct kind of typology within the swales and toward the edges because of the change in height. It's also limiting the height in this case, and you can see that there's no tall plants right at the edge, so it creates a nice kind of visual entry into the design. Yeah, that's, and then we have another fun thing called pseudoplants, which I'll just mention. Pseudoplants lets you, and I know Ecolopes is kind of working on something kind of like this, maybe more intensive than what we've done with pseudo plants. Pseudo plants just lets you create just fake plants that adopt the there's ways to kind of take the attributes of the environment, the different layers, and then use those to create a bunch of different niches within these pseudo plants. And that allows you to quickly explore, even if you don't have plant data set up, or if you're doing maybe a slightly more conceptual or academic exercise, you could use pseudo plants for that. And we like it just because it generates these fun. We like to use our own color palette, so to do some fun examples. But you can see how these kind of typologies are occurring, within this as well. You don't see any of those red plants in the center, and and up here we don't see any of the purple or red. There was actually one of the rules within this particular set of planting was the elevation, so that we had elevation ranges was one of the niches that was sort of applied randomly. I think there was also a height restriction here, so that it was actually based, rather than on a proximity mapping, it was based on an elevation mapping. So the higher up we are, the shorter the plant can be. And that's just not changing the plant height, that's changing like the max height of the speed. It's changing the limitation of what the max height is for a species. So it's limiting which species, not just changing the plant height, just to be clear.